If you've ever been made to feel like you were in the way inside a home you helped build, this story is going to hit you right in the chest. Because there's a special kind of pain that comes when your own child treats you like an inconvenience, like something to be moved aside for someone else's comfort. The night my son sent me to a hotel so his in-laws could stay in my house, I smiled and packed my bag without arguing. But what he didn't know was that the moment I closed that door behind me, the truth was already moving faster than his plan, and within an hour, the carefully balanced story he had told everyone began to fall apart in ways he couldn't control. Being asked to leave your own home doesn't always come with shouting or cruelty. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in politeness, dressed up as a favor you're being asked to do for the sake of everyone's comfort. That softness can make the request feel harder to challenge, because it doesn't look like disrespect on the surface. It looks like a compromise. But compromise only works when both sides are giving something up. In that moment, I realized I was the only one being asked to move, to adjust, to make myself smaller so someone else could feel more at ease in a space I had spent years creating. I tried to tell myself that it wasn't personal. That it was just about logistics, about personalities clashing, about trying to make guests feel welcome. Those explanations were easier to hold onto than the truth that the request revealed something deeper, about how my place in the family was being seen. It wasn't just about where I slept for a few nights. It was about whether my presence in my own home was considered essential or optional. Being asked to step aside, even temporarily, placed me in a category I had never imagined for myself within my own walls. The house had been my anchor through years of change. It had witnessed me carry responsibility when I felt unprepared for it. It had held the echoes of late-night conversations, quiet mornings, the everyday routines that slowly build a sense of belonging. Every repair I made, every bill I paid, every small improvement I added had been an act of claiming that space as mine. To be asked to leave it, even with the promise that it was temporary, created a strange emotional dissonance. The place that had always felt like an extension of myself suddenly felt like something I could be moved out of for convenience. There's a subtle humiliation in being displaced without malice. It doesn't come with open hostility that you can push back against. It comes with reasonable-sounding explanations that make you question your own reaction. I caught myself wondering if I was being dramatic, if I should just be flexible, if this was one of those moments where you choose peace over pride. That internal negotiation is exhausting because it pits your need for dignity against your desire to maintain harmony. Choosing harmony can feel noble, but when it comes at the cost of your own sense of place, it leaves a residue of quiet resentment. As I packed my bag, the reality of what was happening began to settle in. Each item I folded felt like a small concession. Not because packing a bag is a hardship, but because of what the act symbolized. I was accommodating someone else's comfort in a way that made my own comfort secondary. The physical act of leaving the house highlighted the emotional act of being set aside. I walked through rooms I knew intimately, noticing details I had taken for granted, aware that for a few nights, those spaces would function without me, as if my presence was not integral to the life of the home. Driving away brought a wave of thoughts I hadn't expected. I wasn't angry in the way I thought I might be. I felt displaced in a quieter, heavier way. It made me reflect on how easily people can prioritize appearances and convenience over the feelings of someone who has been steady in their lives for years. Being asked to step aside suggested that my steadiness had become invisible. It was assumed, like a piece of furniture that could be moved when the layout needed to change. The hotel room, clean and impersonal, underscored the difference between a place you inhabit and a place you occupy. I could rest there, but it wasn't mine. The unfamiliarity of the space mirrored the unfamiliar role I had been placed in, that of a temporary presence in what had always been my own home. Sitting there, I realized how much of my identity was tied to the idea of having a place where I didn't have to negotiate my presence. Losing that, even briefly, felt like losing a layer of security I had assumed was permanent. Being displaced didn't just challenge my comfort. It challenged my sense of worth within the family dynamic. It forced me to confront how easily the contributions of a parent can fade into the background once the child's life expands to include new priorities. That realization didn't harden me, but it clarified something important. If my place in my own home could be treated as negotiable, then it was time for me to reconsider how I allowed others to define my role within the spaces I had built with my own effort. I hadn't realized how much of an image my son had been carrying until it began to crack. To me, the truth of our situation was simple. I owned the house. I paid the bills. I had built a life there long before anyone else became part of the picture. But to his in-laws, the story they seemed to believe was very different. They spoke to him as if he were the one in charge of the household, as if he were the provider who had opened his home to his parents rather than the other way around. Those assumptions didn't come out of nowhere. They came from a narrative that had been allowed to take shape over time, shaped by what he chose not to correct. There's a subtle difference between letting someone misunderstand and actively presenting a false picture, but the impact can be the same. Silence, in this case, functioned like agreement. By not clarifying who owned the house, my son allowed his wife's family to fill in the blanks with a version of him that made him look more established, more in control, more successful in a way that aligned with their expectations. That version may have felt good to inhabit. It may have made him feel more respected in their eyes. But it was built on a fragile foundation. When identity is constructed on a mission, it only takes one moment of truth to bring it down. The image he had built wasn't just about property. It was about authority. The subtle cues of how decisions were framed, who spoke as if they had the final say, who deferred to whom in conversations about the household. Those cues reinforced the idea that he was the one running the home. I could see how easily that image took hold, because it fit neatly into common expectations about adulthood and masculinity. Being seen as the homeowner, the provider, the one with control over the space likely offered him a sense of pride. But that pride came at a cost. It required minimizing my role, not in words, but in presence. What struck me was how much effort goes into maintaining an image once it's been accepted by others. The longer it exists, the more energy it takes to protect it from contradiction. Small decisions get filtered through the question of how they will appear to the people who believe the image. Sending me to a hotel wasn't just about accommodating his in-laws' preferences. It was about preserving the picture he had allowed them to hold, a picture where he was the one hosting, the one with authority over who stayed in the house. My displacement became a tool for maintaining that illusion. When the truth surfaced, it didn't just correct a misunderstanding. It exposed the gap between who he was presenting himself as and the reality of our situation. That gap carried embarrassment, not because there's shame in not owning a home, but because the image had been built to suggest something that wasn't true. The collapse of that image forced a reckoning, not only with his in-laws, but with himself. It confronted him with the uncomfortable reality that presenting yourself as something you're not can lead you to make choices that harm the people who have supported you. The moment the documents were found, the power of the image dissolved quickly. Authority, that had been assumed based on perception, suddenly had to be re-evaluated based on fact. That shift was jarring, because it revealed how much of our social standing can rest on narratives that go unexamined. Once examined, those narratives lose their grip. The people who had believed in the image were forced to recalibrate their understanding, and in that recalibration, the imbalance of the situation became visible. What hurt most wasn't the misunderstanding itself. It was realizing that the image my son had chosen to inhabit required him to place me in a lesser role within my own home. The story he allowed others to believe about him had room for his in-laws' comfort, but not for my dignity. That realization reframed the situation in a way that was difficult to soften. It showed me how easily the desire to appear a certain way to others can override the obligation to be honest with the people who have stood by you. The truth, when it finally surfaced, didn't just collapse an illusion. It illuminated the values that had shaped the choices leading up to that moment. The collapse didn't come with shouting or dramatic confrontation. It unfolded quietly, almost clinically, in the space between expectations and reality. One moment, the house was being prepared for guests with the assumption that roles were already established. Next, a folder of documents sat on the desk, and the assumptions that had been guiding everyone's behavior had nowhere to hide. The speed of that shift was what made it feel so jarring. When a story has been allowed to grow unchecked, its unraveling can feel abrupt even if the truth has been present all along. What struck me most was how fragile the narrative turned out to be. It had seemed solid because it had gone unchallenged. As long as no one asked questions, the image of who owned the house and who held authority could exist comfortably. The discovery of official papers brought in an external reference point that didn't care about feelings or impressions. Paperwork has a way of cutting through social narratives. It doesn't negotiate. It simply states what is. That simplicity can feel harsh when it interrupts a story people have grown used to believing. The reaction in the room shifted from casual to careful in a matter of minutes. Where there had been easy confidence, there was now hesitation. Where statements had once been made with certainty, questions began to appear. That shift revealed how much of the earlier dynamic had been supported by assumption rather than by fact. The collapse of the story created a vacuum where the truth had to be acknowledged, even if it was uncomfortable. In that vacuum, the power dynamic of the room changed. The people who had spoken with authority were now recalibrating their understanding of the situation. There's something revealing about how quickly certainty can dissolve when it's built on perception alone. The in-laws' belief that their son-in-law was the homeowner had shaped how they interacted with the space and with me. When that belief fell apart, so did the confidence that came with it. The realization didn't just alter their understanding of ownership. It forced them to reconsider the dynamics they had accepted as normal. The question of why I had been asked to leave suddenly took on a different weight. What had seemed like a reasonable accommodation began to look like an unjust displacement. For my son, the collapse was more personal. It exposed the gap between how he wanted to be seen and the reality of his situation. The 1-hour time frame between me leaving and the truth coming to light emphasized how thin the line had been between the image and the reality. The story he had allowed to stand hadn't had time to solidify into something more durable. It had been held together by silence and assumption. When confronted with documentation, that silence could no longer carry the weight of the narrative. Watching the collapse from a distance, I felt a mix of emotions. There was sadness in seeing my son confronted with the consequences of an image he had chosen to maintain. There was relief in knowing that I hadn't needed to argue or defend myself for the truth to surface. The facts had done that work on their own. The collapse wasn't something I orchestrated with confrontation. It was something that happened because reality has a way of asserting itself when given the opportunity. The immediacy of the collapse also highlighted how quickly situations can change when hidden truths come into the open. 1 hour earlier, the request for me to leave had been framed as a simple logistical choice. 1 hour later, that same request was revealed as part of a larger misrepresentation. The speed of that transition didn't leave much room for rationalization. It forced everyone involved to sit with the reality of what had happened without the buffer of time to soften it. In that sudden exposure, the dynamic of the family shifted. Roles that had been assumed had to be renegotiated. Respect that had been unevenly distributed had to be reconsidered. The collapse of the narrative created an opportunity for honesty that hadn't existed before. It wasn't comfortable, but it was clarifying. The truth, once visible, changed the context of every interaction that followed, making it harder to return to the previous assumptions that had shaped the situation up until that moment. There's a particular kind of relief that comes when you realize you don't have to carry the burden of confrontation alone. For a long time, I had felt the tension of being undervalued in my own space, but I hadn't wanted to turn that tension into conflict. I worried about creating rifts, about being seen as difficult, about upsetting the fragile balance between families. That hesitation kept me quiet, even when something felt wrong. When the truth surfaced on its own, it lifted a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. I didn't have to raise my voice or defend my position. Reality did that work for me. Allowing the truth to speak can feel risky, because it means stepping back from the urge to control how things unfold. There's a comfort in believing that if you just explain yourself clearly enough, people will understand and change. But explanations can be argued with. Facts are harder to dismiss. When the documents were discovered, they brought clarity without needing interpretation. They didn't require persuasion. They simply presented what had always been true. In that clarity, the narrative that had placed me on the margins of my own home could no longer stand unchallenged. The quiet nature of that shift was what made it powerful. There was no dramatic reveal, no public calling out. The truth entered the room as part of ordinary life, through papers that had always been there but hadn't been seen. That ordinariness stripped away any sense of spectacle. It grounded the moment in reality rather than emotion. The impact came not from how the truth was delivered, but from what it revealed about the situation that had been taken for granted. Stepping back and letting reality unfold also protected me from being drawn into emotional negotiations. If I had confronted my son directly about how his actions made me feel, the conversation might have centered on emotions rather than on the underlying issue of ownership and respect. Emotions are valid, but they can be minimized or reframed by others who don't want to confront the implications of their behavior. The presence of clear facts shifted the focus from how I felt to what was actually happening. That shift mattered because it addressed the root of the problem rather than just the symptoms. There's a strength in restraint that isn't always recognized as strength. Choosing not to intervene immediately can feel like passivity, but it can also be an intentional decision to allow situations to reveal their own truths. In my case, restraint created space for the discrepancy between image and reality to become visible without my intervention. That visibility changed the conversation in a way that confrontation alone might not have. It moved the dynamic from personal disagreement to shared acknowledgement of what was true. Watching the truth do its work also reminded me that you don't have to manage other people's perceptions for them. For a long time, I had quietly carried the weight of preserving harmony, even when that harmony came at the expense of my own dignity. Letting the truth surface, without cushioning it, allowed the responsibility for managing the resulting discomfort to fall where it belonged. It wasn't mine to absorb. The discomfort belonged to those who had benefited from the misunderstanding. There's an unexpected peace that comes from this kind of letting go. It doesn't erase the hurt of being sidelined, but it reframes how you relate to that hurt. Instead of feeling responsible for fixing the emotional fallout of someone else's choices, you can focus on honoring your own reality. That focus creates a steadiness that isn't dependent on others' reactions. You become anchored in what is true rather than in how things are perceived. In allowing the truth to speak for itself, I wasn't seeking revenge. I was stepping out of a role where I felt I had to advocate for my place in my own life. The truth did that advocacy on its own. That shift in how the situation unfolded changed the tone of everything that followed, creating space for boundaries to be respected not because they were demanded, but because they were grounded in reality. Reclaiming dignity isn't always loud. Sometimes it happens in the quiet choices you make after a boundary has been crossed, in the way you decide what you will and won't accept moving forward. When I told my son that I wouldn't be stepping aside in my own home again, it wasn't delivered with anger. It was delivered with a steadiness that surprised even me. That steadiness came from finally recognizing that protecting my sense of self didn't require hostility. It required clarity. Setting that boundary reshaped how I saw my role in the family. For years, I had carried the weight of accommodation, as if it were synonymous with love. I believed that keeping peace meant smoothing over moments of discomfort, even when those moments chipped away at my sense of worth. Drawing a line forced me to reevaluate that belief. It showed me that peace built on self-erasure isn't peace at all. It's silence wearing the costume of harmony. The aftermath of setting that boundary wasn't immediate resolution. There were awkward moments. Conversations felt different. The easy assumptions that had once guided interactions were replaced by a cautious recalibration. That recalibration wasn't comfortable, but it was honest. It signaled that the old dynamic had been disrupted, and that disruption created room for something new to form. Respect doesn't appear overnight. It grows when boundaries are held consistently enough for others to adjust their expectations. I noticed that the way my son spoke to me began to change subtly. There was more care in his tone, more awareness of how his requests might land. That awareness wasn't born out of fear. It was born out of recognition. Recognition that my presence in his life wasn't guaranteed by obligation alone, but sustained by mutual regard. That shift, however small, marked the beginning of a more balanced dynamic. Reclaiming dignity also meant allowing myself to feel the full weight of what had happened without rushing to minimize it. It meant acknowledging that being asked to leave my own home had hurt, and that the hurt was valid. In the past, I might have brushed those feelings aside to avoid discomfort. This time, I let them know how I moved forward. Not in a way that fueled resentment, but in a way that clarified what I needed in order to feel respected. There's a subtle empowerment in choosing your own comfort without apology. For a long time, I had placed my comfort second to maintaining appearances and smoothing over tensions. Reclaiming dignity meant giving myself permission to value my own sense of security in my home. That permission didn't isolate me from my family. It grounded me within myself. It allowed me to engage with them from a place of stability rather than from a place of quiet sacrifice. Boundaries, when held with care, don't have to fracture relationships. They can redefine them. They invite others to meet you in a space of mutual respect rather than one-sided accommodation. That invitation isn't always accepted immediately. It can take time for people to adjust to a version of you that no longer absorbs discomfort on their behalf. But over time, that adjustment can lead to interactions that feel less strained and more genuine. In reclaiming my dignity, I wasn't closing myself off from love. I was refining how love moved through my life. I was choosing a version of connection that didn't require me to step aside in my own story to make room for someone else's comfort.